The literary criticism I was assigned was New Historicism or Historical Criticism, and it was founded around the 1980s, early 1980s, and it was founded by Stephen Greenblatt. And despite being surrounded by other big movements such as feminism, it was very dominant in the literature, and a lot of people saw that with what was like their first idea, first type of criticism they would look at, since it was a lot of times easier to see the historical context, since at that point a lot had happened with things like world wars, the Cold War that was happening at the time, and just a lot of other influential historical happenings. New historicism, it basically assumes that everything in a story or in literature happens as a result of what is happening historically around that time, such as maybe a book written around the time of World War II. It's a book about a character overcoming some greater evil and like liberating people or something. It could oftentimes represent maybe a victory over the Communist Party during World War II. Uh, and it connects the literature to what's happening at the time that the author is going through or the life of the author. So a lot of times historical criticism is lumped together with biographical criticism because a lot of times you have to understand the author and their upbringing to understand why they're writing things the way that they are. Like maybe why they write their male characters in a certain way. Maybe they had a certain relationship with their father, or why did they write the female characters in such a way? Because, for example, in the 1980s with feminist movements, maybe the author being surrounded by very revolutionary feminists that were very strong, powerful, independent, he would oftentimes they maybe the author would oftentimes write their female characters as these strong, independent lead characters. In a lot of my sources, like Purdue Owl, I've seen that it oftentimes says that New Historicism is essentially a retelling of history itself. When you look at literature, all literature is just a retelling of history itself, and a lot of times it's brung up by asking questions like, what was happening during this time? Why did it happen? What was the outcome of said thing? Especially after major movements or major wars or impactful eras. A literary debate that I saw that I feel like could have some tie in to why New Historicism came about was about the ancients versus modern debates. The ancient versus modern debates was essentially during the Renaissance times. A lot of people were separated in literature, saying that we need to preserve classic literature from the ancient Greeks and Romans because they were like the peak of literature. It couldn't get any better than that. And there were some people known as the moderns who challenged it. And they said, well, if we could challenge ancient medicine, ancient science, who's to say we can't challenge like the ancient arts and advance with society? And that was essentially the start of a lot of the Renaissance, of the rebirth, and that could be said of maybe a start of how historical criticism was created. And the idea was, as times are changing, the understanding of literature and people and society also advances, which is why after that debate, a lot more people were trying to figure out, well, maybe this person wrote this piece of literature because of what happened during this time. Because of that ancients and moderns debate, a lot of people were questioning a lot more about what's happening during this time, and this time. New historicism also kind of resists the idea that history is like linear. Like this happened, like it's not cause and effect. It's very they resist the notion that event A happened, so event B will happen, then it caused event C. it believes that history has a lot more. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more things coming in, and there's a lot more depth to it. It's not just a very straight line of this happened because this happened because this happened. And a lot of times in literature, especially now, we see the idea of new historicism with with social structure or social classes such as race, gender, uh, what class you're in, like rich or poor. A lot of times we see that now, and we even see it with Sweat and the Chrysanthemums actually, both being the Sweat being more about race and gender roles, and the Chrysanthemums being more about gender roles. And but you can also see it with culture, politics, the economy of certain countries, religion, and languages. Um, but a lot of times when you mix it in with culture and politics, it's very apparent of what historical event is being portrayed. Because historical and biographical criticisms have a very close relationship, uh, it helps a lot of times to always start with what the author is when you're reading the story in any literature or text, I believe. Uh, and it kind of can go into maybe a bit of psychoanalysis because when you're learning about the author and their upbringing and the times they wrote the literature and how they interacted with other people, cultures, social structures, you learn a lot about why they write certain characters in a way. As I mentioned earlier, if they were a young child during a very big feminist movement, he might write a lot of motherly figures as strong, independent women because that's the people that the author grew up around. Um, and when you look more into the psychoanalytic part of it, you begin to understand it more and more. And what I've noticed with a lot of these criticisms is that they bounce off of each other. Like, even if you focus on one type of criticism, it kind of dips into other types, like, which is why I'm comparing historical, biographical, psychoanalytic, and say, for instance, that the author was part of like the LGBT community. It could also go into queer theory and maybe go into a lot of other types of criticisms. A very cool trick that I use to spot how new historicism is used in a text is to take the original meaning of what the text is about and apply it to how that reflects the major events going on in that story. Uh, because when you're learning what the author writing it has an original intent, they think I want it to portray this, or I want to leave this message with the reader, and they will do it in a way that doesn't maybe like it implies the real events in history. It doesn't just say them out loud. It uses maybe different names, different types of cultures, different types of characters to represent what's happening in the real world. And it's very like when you're watching a movie or reading something, it's at first not too easy to spot because you're thinking of these characters as an original story that you don't know anything of. But the more you think about things, the more you think about the characters, the events, and the plot, you can begin to realize, oh, it's kind of like this event in history. It's kind of like when this happened in real life. So, to summarize what historical criticism is and what new historicism is, it's essentially that the reason why a literature is the way that it is because of the way history is making itself around that time. And it assumes that everything is happening as everything in the text is happening as a result to what's happening historically. And it tries to resist the notion that history is linear. There's a lot more complex happenings of why certain events in history go on. And it connects whatever's happening with the author, certain characters, settings, and plots in the story to what is actually happening in real life. And I guess a way, a quote, or a sentence that I like to think about when I think about new historicism is it's the way authors use literature to retell history itself. And that's kind of how I remember what new historicism is and how it affects a story or any kind of literature, even if it's movies, paintings, poems, random stories. It's just retelling history through literature.